Welcome back to Sports Class with Dr. K. I've got just one question for you. Do you believe in miracles? It's hard to believe, but this marks the 40th anniversary of the Miracle on Ice, one of the greatest sporting events ever held and probably the greatest sports upset of all time. So we're going to take this episode and review that amazing event, the Miracle on Ice. Before I get into it though, I want to mention this is just a precursor to what's going to be a huge year of Olympic coverage for Dr. K. We've got a whole series of episodes planned around the 2020 Tokyo Olympics. So subscribe to the channel if you're interested in that to get reminders about those episodes and others. For now, let's talk about the Miracle on Ice. First, a little bit of background. In February 1980, the mood in the country was miserable. The Vietnam War was still on people's minds, even though it had ended a few years before. The economy was cratering, and just a few months prior to the Olympics, 52 Americans had been taken hostage in Tehran, Iran. They would remain there for 444 days, right through the period of the Olympics. So it was into that mood that the American athletes headed to Lake Placid for the Olympics, and the U.S. hockey team went on their spirited march. Now, the hockey team entered those Olympics with kind of low and modest expectations. They had won the gold medal in 1960 at the Squaw Valley Olympics, but since then, the American Olympic team had gone 11-14-1 in Olympic competition. They won the silver medal in 1972, but other than that, had not had much success, so expectations were modest in 1980. They were going to face a tough batch of teams in Lake Placid. The Canadian team, the Czechoslovakian team, the Nordic teams were all very good and probably had higher expectations than the U.S. But none were better than the Soviets. The mighty Soviet team, while the Americans had struggled since 1960, the Soviets had won the gold medal in every Olympics since then. And this was also the height of the Cold War, so that rivalry was huge in global politics. So that sets the stage for the game itself. The rules of eligibility were different in 1980 than they are now, so the American team consisted of amateurs. In fact, almost all of the players were either college players or just graduated from college. The average age on the American team was just 22 years old. The Soviets and other Eastern Bloc countries skirted the rules of amateurism in those days. Their players actually played hockey full-time, and most of them had been with the team for years. The government employed them in the military or other kind of jobs like that and allowed them to play hockey full-time. So their team was much older, bigger, stronger, and had actually played with each other for years up against this young team of American college kids. To underscore the superiority of the Soviet team, they had played against the Americans in an exhibition game just a few days before the Olympics started and beat the Americans 10-3. So there wasn't a whole lot of hope going into the Olympics that the Americans would win the gold medal. But as is so beautifully portrayed in the movie Miracle, Coach Herb Brooks had different plans for that American team. He had actually employed a new strategy, what he called the American style. He encouraged his players to weave and flow across the ice, with lots of passing the puck into open spaces, rather than the slow, cumbersome defensive game they had traditionally played with lots of checking into the boards. And that new style was about to pay dividends in this 1980 Olympic matchup. The team had a tough draw just to make it to the medal round. In their opening game against one of the top teams in the world, Sweden, they made a miraculous goal with 27 seconds remaining in the game just to manage a 2-2 tie, which ended up being very important for them making the medal round. Then they knocked off heavily favored Czechoslovakia, Norway, Romania, and West Germany in a game that they trailed 2-0. They won all of those games, making their way into the medal round. That set up the big matchup against the Soviets. The Soviet team was anchored by goalie Vladislav Tretiak, the best goalie in the world at that time. The Soviets had outscored their opponents 51-11 in the 5 games leading up to the medal round, an average score of about 10-2, outscoring their opponents. The U.S. fell behind early, and it might have felt like a replay of that exhibition game they had lost to the Soviets. But they managed to tie it up, and even after the Soviets took the lead again in the first period, Mark Johnson scored a miraculous goal with only 1 second remaining in the first period to tie the game at 2 goals each as they headed to the locker room. The Americans and others were surprised to see Tretiak no longer in the goal after that first period. He was pulled from the game and replaced by Vladimir Mishkin. While he was the backup, he might have been the second best goalie in the world, so the Americans still had their hands full. And in fact, the Soviets took the lead in that second period and the Americans didn't score any goals. The Soviets led 3-2, having outshot the Americans 30-10 in the first 2 periods of the game. Now it was Jim Craig's time to shine. The American goalie had been severely tested throughout the game and actually played really well even though the Americans trailed. But in the final period, he was unflappable. He made save after save, setting up the Americans' remarkable comeback. The Americans, meantime, came from behind once again. Mark Johnson scored his second goal of the game at the 8:39 mark, tying the game at 3-3. That set up one of the most memorable goals in hockey history. Mike Eruzione, the captain of the American team, took a pass from Mark Pavlich with almost exactly 10 minutes left in the game and fired it into the net in the goal that is sometimes known as the shot heard round the world. The Americans now led 4-3 with 10 incredible minutes left in the game. Those 10 minutes seemed to last for an eternity as the Soviets pressed forward and Jim Craig made save after save. As the final seconds ticked down, Al Michaels made his memorable call, "Do you believe in miracles? Yes!" And the Americans won the game 4-3. As exciting as that was, it's easy to forget that game wasn't for the gold medal. The Americans still had one more game to play, and Coach Herb Brooks pushed his team relentlessly that night and the next day through practice, reminding them, we still have one more game to play. If you lose the gold medal game to the Finns, then everything you fought for will be lost. That final game against Finland was almost as exciting as the game against the Soviets, and actually it played out in remarkably similar fashion. The Americans fell behind early, tied it up, and then fell behind again heading into the third period. The call this time from Al Michaels as the clock clicked down, "This impossible dream comes true!" And the Americans had in fact won the gold. At the medal ceremony, Mike Eruzione called the whole team onto the top of the medal stand, another memorable image from this incredible event. Now that hockey game had lasting implications both in the sports world and outside of it. This is one of the greatest games ever held, one of the greatest upsets in sports history. ESPN called it the greatest sporting event of the century. And the hockey team that year was named Sports Illustrated's Sportsmen of the Year. They appeared on the Wheaties box, they went to the White House, and many of those players have gone on to have successful careers in all kinds of fields, but many of them making public speeches and just talking endlessly about that game itself. Now for the Soviets, the game was a disaster. The team was essentially dismantled after that. The coach was disgraced, many of the players were removed from the team. And in the years that followed, a number of Soviet players defected to the West. The team began to crumble. Even though they won the gold in 1984 and 1988, the Red Machine had begun to crumble. So, there you have it. The miracle on ice 40 years later. I hope this whets your appetite for more Olympic content. Stay tuned throughout the year for more on the Olympics. Like, comment, and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.